Hello everybody, Jane Duncan Rogers here from beforeigosolutions.com, and today I am welcoming Patty Burgess-Brecht from Doing Death Differently and also teachingtransitions.com. Hi Patty, you're very welcome.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you. Always great to be with you, Jane.
Thank you, thank you. Can you tell everybody a little bit about what it is that you do?
Sure. I guess I would call myself, in a sense, an end-of-life educator. My company's doingdeathdifferently.com and teachingtransitions.com are really training companies. And the difference between the two is that Teaching Transitions is more for hospices and colleges and universities, and then Doing Death Differently is really more for individuals who are drawn to work with the dying, and how we can help train and support them through that process, whether it's working with as a volunteer or actually in this kind of new emerging profession called end-of-life doulas, coaches, or guides. So we've got training for that. It's very, very exciting that is kind of emerging now, just the way birth doulas have, and they've kind of paved the way for how people use doulas and coaches and guides for sort of bookending life, in the beginning, coming in, and going out of life. So it's very exciting.
So just on that, not everybody will have heard that term, end-of-life doula,
Sure.
the word doula. So What does that actually mean?
Well, end-of-life doula came from the Greek. It reminds me of the Big Fat Greek Wedding, if you've ever saw that. Give me any word and I tell you where it comes from in the Greek, So doula was Greek. I should spray some Windex right now or something. But doula is, and in some ways I'm not sure about, I am sure about the term, but it's a woman who serves, one who serves, because it doesn't have to be a woman, obviously. There can be end-of-life doulas, but primarily it's women who are serving, and in that respect, serving the dying. And certainly the term hospice, coming from hospitable, and being able to bring into sort of a communal kind of setting, one who serves, and then within a community. So end-of-life doula is really one who serves, and it's we throw on end of life to start to identify that it is serving those who are facing the end of life.
Okay, great. Okay, that's wonderful. So I know you've got a lovely story about why you started doing this work, but I just wanted to say right at the beginning that the title for today's interview is provided by Patty, is Moving from Scared to Sacred. And I really love that, because it's just the moving of one little letter in that word makes a huge difference. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But tell everybody about how you got involved in doing this work.
Well, it's funny because when working with the dying, generally nobody wakes up and says, oh, I think I'll just try it and go work, hang out with some dying people and see how that goes. It's not what people's experience is. It's usually something that brings them there. And in my case, it was, going on probably about 17, I can't believe it's been this long ago, but I had a dear friend who I was with pretty much every day from diagnosis to death. And the diagnosis that she had was end-stage lung cancer, which is interesting because she wasn't a smoker. It was that kind of lung cancer that Christopher Reeve's wife, had gotten. And it was crazy because she was this fitness person. In fact, I remember spending some time with her in the hospital, and when she got out, she wanted to go walk 3 miles. I was just trying to keep up. And she had this, end-stage diagnosis. So we spent a lot of time together, and it was Rona, it was her name, Rona, introduced me to hospice. And at the time, I didn't know what hospice was. I thought it was a place, and it was because it was a place that she went when her symptoms were not under control, but have since come to find out, since I began working in the hospice industry, that it's really a philosophy of care, how we care for those who are leaving this world. And I was blown away that there was this, come to find out, a movement, a philosophy of care where there was no cost, and it would support her family, and people like me who are friends were just trying to understand what she was going through and how we could best support her. And as we continued on down the road and through the trajectory of her illness, and things changed and her decline happened for her, I got to witness some amazing things. I got to witness, when pretty much everybody was sort of turning away, kind of like doing what they needed to do and then hightailing it out of there, she and I were diving deep. I was fascinated that in whatever period of time that the universe had for her, she was going to be gone. We were no longer going to be having this connection. So in many cases, she taught me what it's like to die. I got to witness it. The bandwidth of emotion that opened up for me and for her during this process was stunning. It could go from complete heartbreak to just outrageous hilarity in like 20 seconds flat. And I thought, am I schizophrenic, or is something wrong here? It was so emotionally peaked and so intense, but such depth and such beauty, even in this raw, hard place. And it was very hard because she was saying goodbye to 3 young boys, ages, what were they, 13, 11, and 9. Mm-hmm. But had it not been for hospice, she would have never made it to her oldest son's bar mitzvah. And she had all these little goals. So I noticed what I learned with end of life, it wasn't about giving up hope. It was about the changing focus of hope. And hope could be not about a cure. Mm-hmm. It could be about, how do I get to my son's bar mitzvah? How do I get to be conscious and still be with my children for whatever time I have left? Whatever that goal was, mm-hmm. Hospice made it happen. And I was smitten, really. I couldn't believe it. So after she died, I waited a couple of years and began volunteering. And then I became a volunteer trainer. And then I began working at hospice as it's funny because they do have marketers in hospice. So we were marketing hospice. But, it's interesting because people really have a lot of confusion about what hospice is.
Yeah.
So the marketing was needed. And then that's what kind of drew me into, I was really always drawn to the volunteer side and to training, but in a way that captured this beautiful experience I had with training, but wanting to bring it on kind of an online approach so that we could have almost a live event online that was still replete with experiential exercises and meditations and visualizations and all of these great elements that would get people very engaged. And that's how I got here.
How wonderful.
Long story, but I'm here.
That's fine. It's wonderful. Well, that rich history is what we all benefit from, and all your clients and clientele benefit from, and that's really wonderful. So,
thank you.
In a way, then actually, it's true to say that your work would, as it is now, would not be existing without Rona and her input, even though she has died.
Absolutely. It had, and I have her here. I don't know if you can see it. There's a picture of she and I right there. There's me looking a lot younger. And the good thing about death is you always look that way. She died at 45 and she's still all looking that way and good. And she did not look sick. It was amazing because she had been so healthy and so young. But had it not been for Rona, I don't know what I'd be doing. I mean, I had always been in some version of healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I think I would have stayed with that because it seemed like that's where my career started. But what I find about, I call it the death business or death, is that there is this, people sometimes question it when I say this delicious mystery. Mm-hmm. There's a mystery that's never ending when it comes to death mm-hmm. and grief and loss. And the crazy thing to me is that death is this great connector, this great kind of like equalizer and leveler. In so many places in life, we walk into a room and we make these automatic assessments about somebody, or they wouldn't understand me, or they're not like me. And when we boil it all down, we're born and we die. And if we can find these commonalities, we can find these places of connection, death is one of them. Yes. And death also makes people a little bit, you know, I remember a friend of mine telling me when she was working and she was going to go, do her hospice volunteer work. Whenever she would tell her boss, oh, she had to leave to go do hospice volunteer, her boss would always go, oh, okay, and like look away, bow his head and look away, you know. So as if she was talking about some female body part or something, but she said it was great because if I ever needed him to kind of back off, I could just say, I'm going to do hospice work. That kind of reverence that people have around it, it makes kind of a little pause, a little space. And I love that little space in there because it's a place that for all of us is this sacred part. I think it brings up whatever it does for each of us. And I think that's part of the beauty of this work too, is that we get to, if you're so interested, I mean, I personally love the exploration of the journey of the inner landscape. And so death is this great, powerful self-development, personal growth kind of tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So just a little bit more about that transition from scared to sacred, will you?
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's such a lovely little play on the words there.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount behind it, you know, this transition from fear to something, well, godly, if you want to use that word.
Yes, absolutely. So to me, scared to sacred, and you brought it up in the beginning, it's just two letters that are flipped. And I like that flipped part because, you know, many times people feel paralyzed or oppressed by this word death. And I believe it's really an invitation. And this invitation asks us to look at our own fears, our own beliefs, our own limitations around what death is all about. And for some, you know, it's interesting because many of the families and the people that I've worked with who are leaving this world and the family saying goodbye, I look at the family dynamics, which are often so very interesting. And you see that the people who have not a lot of unfinished business between them have the hardest time with, it could be letting go or with feeling very present there. You know, if somebody, let's say, is financially dependent upon the person who's going, there could be a lot of, you know, anger, a lot of things going on. But when we decide that we're going to kind of take care of them, and frankly, that's a lot of the work that you do, getting that before I go workbook done.
Yeah.
Much of when we decide to look at it versus away, we can begin to take that word scared and sort of dissolve it out and bring it back up to sacred. It's the looking at it that changes it. And it's not for the faint of heart, and I don't think everybody's going to do it, but I do believe that when people choose to say, I'm going to go there, let's say there's somebody that they don't like visiting hospitals, but they move there anyway, and they do that, and they take that time, or they, again, do your workbook and find out some of the questions that need to be asked. Sometimes it's not just, you know, what are the passwords to my account? Sometimes it's, you know, what's my relationship to whatever this experience or this feeling is.
Yeah.
And so examining it and not running away and sitting with it a little bit longer than one thinks they can.
Yeah.
I think is the key.
Which is interesting because it means you need to be willing to be uncomfortable maybe, and to sit with being uncomfortable for a bit, and to have the courage to do that. But that's what being scared is about. I mean, people, you know, when people say, oh, you're so brave, you know, nobody ever feels brave. You feel scared, you know.
Exactly.
People think you're brave and think you have courage, but actually it feels scary, but you do things anyway. And that's what you're talking about, really. And it's in that, it's in that facing up to what it is that you think you're scared of, that actually that's where the flip happens and it can become sacred. Yeah.
That's right. And sometimes it's not always, you know, pretty. And I want to let folks know that, you know, it's not always, sacred doesn't always mean that is all perfectly wrapped up into a neat little, wrapped up package. Sometimes pretty is sometimes sacred is a little messy before it gets pretty again, let's say. And that could be in the form of a conversation that's a really rough conversation to have with somebody. And there's lots of things that we can do. I don't even know if we have time here, but, initiating a conversation yourself, talking about your own wishes and hopes and dreams that somehow can spur on others. But there's plenty of ways to do this. I think it's the willingness to start, and then maybe organically let it unfold from there.
Okay. So, so I was intrigued when I was looking at your website, doing death differently. What does it mean to you to do death differently? Because, those three words are quite important. Doing implies action. You've just hinted there about, having conversations with somebody. That's an action. It's clear that we need to do it differently because it's clear to us perhaps, so we need to do it differently. I hope it's clear to the listeners. What does it mean to you to do it differently?
Well, I think just one of the tenets of that is really the beginning to explore, because we're in a kind of death deflection society, or we look away. So the willingness to engage, the willingness to be present with another, and many times people say, well, I've heard that term, but what does that mean, presence? I think what it means is coming to a scenario, whatever it is, whether it's death, in this case it is, or loss or grief, or another's loss or grief, when one doesn't know what to do, and that's showing up without a personal agenda, without a need to fill in the gaps, without a need to say something. And sometimes even getting to that point requires a little bit of personal exploration. But being able to show up wholeheartedly, and in our training we call it kind of a listening as if you were a big heart with ears. That again, that death gives us the opportunity to slow down. So I think to be willing to examine our own fears and limitations, to be able to show up wholeheartedly without an agenda. And that can take some practice. It really can, because how many times when we're talking with another are we formulating something in our heads that we're going to say back in return? One of the reasons I love working in this death and dying industry, because I get to practice that. I mean, I'm human too. I don't have it all figured out. I get to practice those kind of communication styles that allow me to slow down and be more present. And that kind of, works whether we're talking about death and dying or we're talking about life and living.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that image, by the way, of the big heart with the ears. I mean, that is something that people can really, you can imagine that. And actually, as you said, you can apply that to anything. It doesn't have to be, something to do with death. And in fact, if you want practice, you can probably start practicing your big heart with ears the minute you stop listening to this call.
That's right. The minute you're talking to that next challenge. What's that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's just lots of opportunities once you start thinking about how you might start listening, really listening, instead of listening to your own inner voice going on and on at the same time as apparently listening to someone else. We have opportunities all the time. It's wonderful. Okay.
Absolutely.
So, let me just see. There was a couple of questions that I specifically wanted to ask you as, we might have covered quite a lot of them. Yeah, it was the thing about this death deflection. I haven't heard that term before, but it really sums it up, what we tend to do in the West, which is pushing it away. And you touched on that before. But what do you think is the negative impact that happens when we push it away?
Well, I think it's a spectrum, and depending upon the particular person, the family dynamics, those kinds of things, the effects can be minimal or devastating. And I think, let's say, minimal, on one end of the spectrum, it could be that we missed opportunities for connection. And when we miss opportunities for connection and someone is gone, that doesn't mean that we can't speak with them energetically afterwards, but maybe for that person who's remained, it doesn't have the same kind of impact. I think one of the biggest things that people are afraid of with death is having regrets. I don't want any regrets. Well, that's a tough one, because to not have any regrets, we have to engage.
Yeah.
Because if we don't engage, then ultimately we have things that we haven't said, we haven't we haven't expressed, or maybe even haven't thought about enough to even be able to formulate what that expression might look like.
Yeah.
So on that end of things, it could be missed opportunities. On the other end of things, it could be information that was vital for that family unit or another person to go on after the fact, that because people had their heads in the sands, or they didn't want to really understand that this was, end of life, that this person wasn't going to survive maybe another round of whatever their illness was placing before them, that, there could be lots of information that could be very, very helpful to their financial situation, to their emotional situation. It could be as simple as somebody thinking they had more time and they would just have that conversation later. And now there's a lot of information that's missing. That, and you know this again very well with your Before I Go workbook. I feel like there are so many practical parts of death that if people even focused on that alone versus the emotional piece, that maybe one or the other could come. In other words, if we use the entree as the practical piece, then that opens the doorway for maybe some more emotional connection. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, a personal style. I probably tend to lead with my heart a little bit more, so I would go in with those emotional things and say, oh, by the way, while we're here, I think these are some important things to talk about, which might be practical.
Yeah.
So, but more so, whether they're small or large opportunities, these missed opportunities and regrets. And if anybody, and we all have ever lived with regrets and wished we could have do-overs, I don't think there's anything worse, because it's kind of a nagging, corrosive kind of thought that where we beat ourselves up. And so, for those kinds of things, again, and I don't want people to beat themselves up if they didn't have those conversations and now they're not able to, because I truly believe if we're all energy, that energetically that information gets out there, so we can still have those conversations. And I wouldn't dismiss that opportunity just because a person's no longer here. As I said to my stepdaughter the other day, I said, my father's been dead for almost, what has it been now, 17 years, and I still fight with him on a regular basis. The difference is I get the last word in. I'm telling you, it's cathartic. It's cathartic to be able to fight with my father, who was an attorney, who was always right. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's a really good point you make, because it's that's down to a belief system, perhaps.
Yes.
Continue to have a conversation with somebody after they die. I mean, it's very different, especially when somebody is newly bereaved.
Yes.
That the fact that they are not around in a physical body anymore is devastating, and we don't want to minimize that. Some people are maybe open and able to have some form of communication, perhaps like what you're saying. Other people maybe don't believe that, but have it anyway, or do believe it, but nothing happens. I would never, for example, have imagined that I would have been, I'm fairly open and quite psychic and all this sort of stuff. And when my husband died, was there any word from him? No. What's going on here?
Hello, Philip, where are you? We've been talking for all these years and now you're going silent on me, right?
Exactly. So, but I think, can you just say a little bit more about, because the way you talk about it, Patty, makes it very ordinary, like that conversation, having an argument with your dad and winning.
I do. And I that's what I want to do. I think my biggest job here is to normalize death. And to let people know that while while this process can be very sacred, there's also sacred in the ordinary and in the normal. So for me, I think when I share things like still have that conversation, it's not always about, and truly I feel this way about having a conversation either written or myself with somebody who's living. It's not about their response, because even though, wouldn't that be nice? Yes. And many people do get that sort of two-way from maybe a psychic or a kinesthetic feel. But it's really about unfinished business. If you're the one that's feeling that compelling urge to complete that business or to have this conversation, it really doesn't matter what or if there is any kind of response. It's about you being able to express and being able to kind of clear your own sort of consciousness, your own need for that kind of expression. So I wouldn't, and maybe I should have been a little clearer on that, I wouldn't suggest to somebody that they just talk to somebody in the hopes that there's an answer, because one-way conversations often, when we're having them either out loud or in writing, I think they can also trigger a lot of things that might need some attention.
Okay.
And unless we begin to have that attention, unless we start it, to me, it's almost like a starter, what's an igniter, I guess, a conversation starter. And I know for me, one thing leads to another. When I'm expressing, something else comes up that might need to be addressed, that was just under the surface, that wasn't going to come out until I started. Yeah. So it's just again, another personal growth tool, whether that person is still here. Now, obviously, if there's some unfinished business and some complicated grief, either pre-grieving before someone is leaving or after they've left, and you're noticing, my suggestion would be, if you're noticing that there's some complication to this, that seeking assistance of a friend, or if it's more complicated than that, of a therapist, is really important. And many times therapists or coaches will bring a person through a process like I'm describing, so that there's a kind of a cathartic release, I guess you could say, when we're talking about expression of oneself. And to me, it is normal, but that's my own belief system, and I recognize that everybody's belief system is different. The other thing too, I think people are a little concerned with, is that maybe it's a little irreverent, to speak to or say things. Yeah. Oh, well, again, let's normalize it. We're these human beings with these complicated feelings, and I actually think it's pretty healthy for me to talk to yell at my father, where there was some complications with that relationship. I think it's healthy to do it. I feel much better, and I also gained some insight doing that I hadn't had before. Sure. And in the years that he's been gone, I would say in the beginning, when I first, it wasn't right away, it might have been a year or two after he was gone, when I started to feel these feelings that I needed to express some of this unfinished business. And I've noticed in the last, 15 or so years, it's not as much. When it comes up, I do. And it's kind of like the onion layer. It peels off. Yeah. And
okay, so that's really important, because this thing about unfinished business, it's like, especially if somebody has died suddenly and you've got unfinished business. Yes. Well, of course you're going to have unfinished business, probably, if a sudden death has happened. So, but what I'm hearing is that actually it's possible to deal with unfinished business even if the person has already died.
Yes,
and to understand that if you're going to, if you're having an argument with them, or if you're needing to express difficult feelings, that's okay. It's not about, we have this thing of you shouldn't speak ill of the dead. I mean, that's still goes around. I think that's ridiculous, because
I do too, because
it's definitely not normalizing it.
It's definitely not normalizing, and I totally understand that, because I have felt that too. But what I've said to myself, when I've heard, I think about somebody like Steve Jobs that had a very conflicted, here was a genius, but I heard he was like a jerk. Like, if you're like a jerk in life, like, then you're just a dead jerk, and I don't mean to be, that sounds terrible, but like, isn't that freeing when you can say that? It doesn't mean we have any less respect. I mean, I'm sitting here with an iPhone. I love him for that reason. But from all the things I've heard and read and the documentaries I've seen, like, he's a jerk and he's dead. And that's okay. That's okay. That is freeing to me. Other people, I would, if you're listening to this now and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe that, I would say, like, look into that. Why to examine that? Why would we be any less honest because someone is no longer existing? And the truth is, I know Steve Jobs, if he tuned into my little radio frequency, just heard that, and he's probably laughing.
Yes.
And maybe he's hearing on an energetic level, well, like, gosh, if all these people think this, next time around, I better just step up my game a little. I don't know. I think I'm helping the spirit world a little by just telling it like it is.
Okay, well, just in this interaction here, we're also highlighting the importance of having a sense of humor about all this. And, again, it's like, when somebody that you love dearly dies, of course it's not funny. We're not going to find humor in it. And that is absolutely normal. But certainly a little bit further away from the event, again, talking about this normalizing thing, humor is a part of life. Finding the amusing in a situation or being able to laugh. I mean, laughter in itself is so healing. So I just want to, we don't really have time to go into that. And you said loads today, Patty, which is really helpful.
Yeah, I always say loads.
I want to flag that up, that, humor around death is okay.
That's right. It definitely is. And in fact, about that, I will say, I won't tell you the whole story, but my brother and I literally laughed my mother out of life. The last 5 minutes before she died, there was something hilarious that happened that, well, I'll share with you another day.
Oh, no. Hang on, Patty, you have to tell us right now. We'll just carry on for a little bit longer. That's just too tempting.
Okay, well, it's also, since we've been talking about irreverence and hilarity in death, I'm going to combine the two on this one. So here's the disclaimer right now. So it was about 15 minutes before my mother actually died, but of course, when we were there, we didn't know it was 15 minutes away. And I'd been with her all day, and we'd been watching her breathe, and knowing that it was coming. My brother and his girlfriend were out, and I called them back to say, I think something's happening. Well, I was on the phone in the hallway with my mother's friend who wanted to know what was going on. As I was telling her, my brother called me in the room and said, I think something has changed. So I was here, my husband was next to me, my brother and his girlfriend were on the other side of my mom, and my brother was looking at my mother. And meanwhile, you have to know that everything that was said, I've got some great stories, funny stories of my mother during that time. But so my brother stands up real quickly, and he leans over, and all of a sudden he says, oh my gosh. And I said, Jimmy, what's going on? My brother's name is Jim. What's going on? And he looked stricken. He looked horrified. And he said, I hope Mom doesn't mind if I passed gas. And I said, oh my gosh. And my husband, and now you have to know, my husband's a Presbyterian minister. Before he could stop his mouth from saying, he says, Jim, be careful. It could be her last breath. We just looked at each other. We looked at my husband. We were like, oh my God. We laughed and laughed and laughed. And in about 5 minutes, we looked, and my mother took her last breath.
Wow.
And that's how my mother would have wanted to go. And it could have never been planned. Yeah. My mother was this joyous woman. And she probably would have been horrified that was the way. But I know she was laughing with us. And she had hung on there for maybe 12 hours that day. And within 5 minutes, as we were laughing our guts out, she just peacefully slipped away. It was the most beautiful experience. So There it is. It's all wrapped up. And now when I think of my mother's death, I think of us just holding our sides, crying and laughing, and like shaking our heads like, can you believe this is happening? And there she went.
I love it. That is a really lovely story. Thank you.
And that's her right there.
Oh, that's really nice. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, okay, so we're going to wrap up. Yes, we are going to wrap up. But what if people want to know more about your work? Where should they go? What should they do? What's the best thing for them to take action on?
Sure. They can, if you are, if they're an individual, an individual who is looking to find out more about working with the dying, not only volunteer, but making a living, because that's, as I say, a new emerging profession and people are looking to do that. Mm-hmm. They can go visit doingdeathdifferently.com. Mm-hmm. And there's a training tab where they can click on that and then fill out the little form, and it'll give them all the information on the foundational training. And I'm now putting together some advanced training. Mm-hmm. That's actually kind of got two tracks. One, it's the deeper level skills for end-of-life doula. And by the way, I meant to mention when we were talking about doula, end-of-life doula is practical, spiritual, physical, non-medical support for end-of-life care. So I probably should have mentioned that in the beginning. But the two tracks are a business track, because many people who are very drawn to this work don't have the business side and don't know how to set up that kind of a practice. And then, of course, it's the deeper connection, presence, and skills that we teach for end of life. So I would love it if anybody stopped by and took a look, and I'm always here to answer any questions.
Okay, and you know, if you're listening, you've had a taste of Patty, and I can tell you that in her writing, she's exactly as she is in the way she speaks. So if you felt connected with her and some of her stories here, then please do go and visit her website. So.
And I was going to say, I am an acquired taste, so it's okay if for some reason somebody was like, I don't know about this. It's okay.
Okay, sure.
We'll see you sometimes, but you are going to die, so you're going to want to talk to us sometime.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So that was Patty Burgess-Brecht from doingdeathdifferently.com, and this is Jane Duncan Rogers from beforeigosolutions.com. Thank you.